Then, on August the 8th, Hull opened his supply lines again under the protection of the forces under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Miller. These numbered around 600 men that consisted of regulars, militia from Ohio and Michigan, with the support of cavalry and 2 cannons. They left Detroit for their supply base at the river Raisin. On August 9th, the Americans marched past the village of Magua and was ambushed by a force of 205 native warriors, Canadian militia, and British regulars, under the command of Major Adam Murr. In the fight, the British regulars mistakenly fired on Tecumseh's native troops, who were forced to retreat. The British and native forces' casualties were 1 killed and 23 wounded. The American casualties were 18 dead and 63 wounded. The British, facing heavy fire, were forced to retreat to the river and back to Fort Malden. By this time, Lieutenant Colonel James Miller returned and explained what happened at Magua. They thought he lost his nerve, although he held his ground against the ambush. After these victories, native numbers began to increase quickly as numerous small bands joined Tecumseh's war parties from Ohio and Mississippi. These numbers increased to around 600 by the siege of Detroit, as well as more troops from Canada began to show up as militiamen rallied to the defense of their land. Hull became increasingly nervous at the thought of facing an enemy force of British regulars, sharpshooting backwoodsmen, and 100 angry natives that gave way to near panic. These fears were mostly unwarranted, as the lack of regulars, ill-equipped militia, and divided native forces with loyalty only secured through gifts provided by HMS Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, and General Hunter, requiring the British to have naval superiority of the lakes, and so Procter instructed for the construction of 7 gunboats and a defensive battery on Lake Erie, using a large amount of their resources. Hull knew this too, but the request to counter this measure was denied in Congress. Upon hearing these losses, Hull abandoned the siege on August the 8th and retreated back to Fort Detroit, fearing an attack from the British and native forces, cutting him off from his base of operations. He was right, as the British and native army followed them and began to lay siege to Fort Detroit. A relief column was quickly assembled with cattle and supplies and sent to Fort Detroit under the command of Captain Brush. At one point, Brush sent a message to General Hull, who was in the town of Sandwich, modern-day Windsor, Ontario, that said Tecumseh and some warriors with plausible support from the British regulars were near the town of Brownston and requested support. 200 Ohio militiamen were sent to reinforce the relief column. They were under the command of Major Thomas Van Horn. On the way, the troops crossed Brownstown Creek, and 24 native warriors attacked the column from the south. The Americans panicked and began to retreat. The warriors pursued them as far as the Ecros River, where 18 killed and 12 wounded, with the following 70 missing. The First Nations only had 1 killed. After this skirmish, Hull was convinced that the British and native forces outnumbered them. The same day as the capture of Fort Michilimackinac, the British had another victory, which was the capture of the USS Nautilus, a 16-gun brig, under the command of Lieutenant William M. Crane. The battle occurred when the USS Nautilus was a day's sail away from New Jersey. It happened on a trip from New York. The USS Nautilus was attacked by HMS Shannon, a 38-gun frigate, and the HMS Aeolus, a 38-gun fifth-rate frigate, and was captured. The first vessel lost on either side. On August the 2nd, the British put the Nautilus into service of the Royal Navy, renaming her HMS Emilius after they lost a cruiser-class brig sloop of the same name. On August 13th, Major General Sir Isaac Brock arrived at Fort Malden, sometimes known as Fort Armisburg, due to the close proximity of the village of the same name, with reinforcements from the 41st British Regulars and Canadian militia from Upper Canada, which increased the morale of the garrison, and to help get their militia back together after the initial invasion force landed and attacked the city of Sandwich. It was here where the legendary partnership between Isaac Brock and Tecumseh began, over the plans to attack Fort Detroit. Upon hearing the plans to attack Detroit, against the recommendation of all his officers except for John MacDonald and Robert Nicoll, he decided to attack for 2 reasons: to gain control of the Great Lakes, and to encourage the Western native to join the British, forcing the Americans to remove forces from the invasion to deal with them, thus halting the plans of further invasions. Upon hearing these plans, Tecumseh reportedly declared of Brock, "This is a man," end quote. On August 15th, Brock and Tecumseh put their plans into action. position and quickly liberate the town of Sandwich. And then the British began bombarding the fort. From batteries moved up into Sandwich, and the ships Queen Charlotte and General Hunter, as well as the cannons from Fort Malden. On August 16th, the British and native forces, numbering 1,500 to 2,000 regulars, militia, and native warriors, the Detroit River. The British and Canadian militia deployed to attack from the southwest, and the native warriors from the forest to the north and west of the fort. During a lull in the bombardment, Sir Isaac Brock sent a message to General Hull encouraging him to surrender, saying that once the battle was in full swing, the natives would be beyond his control. This message was ignored, and the artillery opened up again. Brock hoped to use psychological warfare to make Hull surrender, as he outnumbered and outgunned the British and native forces. The popular story of Tecumseh marching his men past the fort 3 times to attempt to make his army look 3 times as big as it was lacks evidence. When they attacked, the sight of advancing redcoats and the shrill war cries of the native warriors demoralized the American defenders, and at 10 a.m. they surrendered before a major bloody assault could take place. Before this surrender, General Hull was even quoted on saying, "I have done what my conscience has directed." End quote. The British marched in, playing the British Grenadiers. Casualties for the Americans were 7 killed during the bombardment, and 2,493 captured, along with the loss of 39 cannons, a large store of weapons, ammunition, and supplies, which was used to equip and feed the militia and native warriors. They also captured an unfinished ship called the USS Adam that they renamed the HMS Detroit in honor of their victory. Casualties for the British and native allies were 2 wounded. This victory secured the Michigan Territory for the British, and the Americans' public reaction was disbelief and fury towards General Hull. He was even court-martialed, and during his case, he pleaded that he was outnumbered and he saved his men and the 700 civilians from the horrors of an Indian massacre, stating, quote, "I have saved Detroit and the territory from the horrors of an Indian massacre, but I also regret that this attack had not been made." End quote. He was sentenced to be executed, but his sentence was commuted. With this flank secured, Brock moved his forces away from Michigan and to the second point of the invasion, in the Niagara Peninsula. Command of the remaining troops was given to Colonel Henry Proctor, the commander of the regulars. He started a defensive campaign holding the Great Lakes region through the recently captured forts, with small disruptive attacks to stop any American military buildup in the Great Lakes region, waiting for the support of the British and troops from Lower Canada. Inspired by Brock's successes, Proctor had a complete change of heart from the beginning of the war. Originally, he thought the defense of Upper Canada was hopeless. But all was not lost for the Americans, as on July 19th, the Americans won their first victory. The battle did not start well, however, as early in the day, the British captured a ship carrying flour on Lake Ontario near the state of New York, near a place called Sacketts Harbor. The ship sent its crew ashore with a message that demanded the harbor surrender the 2 ships, the Oneida and the Lord Nelson, and if the Americans did not peacefully comply, they would burn down the harbor. The Americans sent no response, so later that day, whilst Captain Woolsey was in his ship, the Oneida, he spotted the British ships on the horizon. The ships were the flagship, the Royal George, with 24 guns, the Seneca, with 18 guns, the Prince Regent, with 22 guns, the Earl of Morea, with 20 guns, and a transport ship, the Simcoe, heading up to the harbor. Woolsey attempted to scramble the crew to stop the incoming forces, but failed, and returned to the harbor with its broadside of 9 guns facing the British ships. Captain Woolsey left the Oneida under the command of a lieutenant. He went ashore and took charge of the troops there. Other forces in the harbor were a company of volunteer artillery under the command of Colonel Bellinger and a small unit of militia based in the harbor itself, who were preparing for the attack by firing alarm guns to alert neighboring militia units and building breastworks, which included a 32-pounder gun, which was originally brought in to put on the Oneida under the command of William Vaughan, the sailing master, and the other guns were under the command of Captain William Camp. The building of the breastwork went better than the alerting of the militia, however, as the militia did not arrive in large enough numbers to make a big impact on the battle. As only 3,000 arrived at the harbor in small small groups over the duration of the battle. But a problem came up with the defenses as well, with the cannon. The harbor only had ammunition for 24-pounder cannons. This was quickly resolved when the militia loaded the cannon with aids of wads made up of torn carpet to fit the cannonballs into the bore of the 32-pounder. By the time they were retrieved from the town, the British were in range of the cannon. The British were misinformed about the defenses of the harbor. They didn't know about the cannon, so they attacked in an overconfident air. This is shown when 32-pounder first fired. The British responded with laughter when it bounced off the side of their ship. This attitude quickly changed towards the end of the battle, however, when the Royal George was preparing to fire another broadside and the 32-pounder raked her entire length. With that, the fleet withdrew. The Americans played Yankee Doodle and gave 3 cheers of victory. In a letter to Governor General, Brown attributed his success of the day, the gallant spirit of Wolseley, Bellinger, and Camp, especially to the shots of the 32-pounder by Mr. Vaughan, who had fired this piece. He claims to have the honor of firing the first hostile gun in the war. We all know he was wrong, however. The British raid was a complete failure. One of its ships damaged severely and 8 sailors killed, while the Americans took no casualties. Although Tecumseh was forming a united native territory, the First Nations were still divided on whether to join the war and on what side. Those who were loyal to the British were given gifts to remain loyal to them, via ships on the Great Lakes, like I said earlier, and so the Americans tried to break their control on the lakes to stop these gifts from arriving, to hopefully make the natives join their side or to stop supporting the British overall, and the British fighting back. This caused many naval battles on the Great Lakes. This began with the USS Julia blocking an attack from the HMS Earl of Moray and the HMS Duke of Gloucester on the New York harbor on her way to Ogdensburg. By the 30th, the Julia was armed with 2 6-pounders and the 32-pounder from Sacketts harbor. She was under the command of Lieutenant Wells from the Oneida. The Earl of Moray, on the other hand, was armed with 14 guns, and the Duke of Gloucester with 10 guns. The engagement happened roughly 12 miles away from Ogdensburg. The engagement lasted 3 hours. At one point, the Duke of Gloucester made to board the USS Julia to capture her, but 2 shots from the 32-pounder cannon turned them away, and with that the British retreated. The Julia was victorious, but she was badly damaged and limped back to Ogdensburg, where she had repairs, but she was out of commission till the end of the war. Other than the damage to the ships, there was no casualties on either side. As in many wars that the British fought in this time period, they used the Royal Navy to gain advantage over their foe by blockading them, thus bleeding them of money for their military. The War of 1812 was no exception, with the British blockading the Americans all along the Atlantic seaboard and in the American coast of the Gulf of Mexico. This caused a lot of naval combat in the Atlantic Ocean and the St. Lawrence River, such as on August 13th in the Atlantic theater, the USS Essex, commanded by Captain Porter, engaged the British ship, the HMS Alert, commanded by Captain Loughran. The Essex outgunned the Alert, but they hoped to surprise the Essex by disguising herself as a merchant ship. But the Essex wasn't surprised, and turned sharply when the Alert drew near, and so when the Alert fired her broadside, it landed in the sea harmlessly, and the Essex turned to fire her own broadside, and the 2 ships were locked in combat for 8 minutes. Then the Alert struck its colors, becoming the first British ship to be captured by the Americans.